Welcome everyone to week 7 of the Sprout Quilt Challenge 2025. And I'm so excited to show you my final version of my Sprout Quilt for 2025. It is an on-point art quilt, measures 29 by 50. And it was a lot of fun to do. It went together really super easy, so you'll want to stay tuned for that. But before we get stitching, I want to thank our wonderful sponsors that have been so generous. Of course, Wonderful Specialty Threads for their ongoing support. And this week's sponsors are Carolina Moore Patterns. She's a pattern designer and inventor. She has some really great things. So check her out. I'll put a link for all of our sponsors in the captions. And then Alyssa is always so generous with us, and of course, we want to give them a big thank you for supporting our challenge this year. And Sandrasa from Art Quilt by Design has donated a jelly roll that'll get sent out to this week's winner. So it's time to get stitching. I'm so excited. Today we finally get to start laying out all of our quilt blocks that we've been making over the last 6 weeks into this design that I created. This is designed as a wall hanging, and you'll notice that the blocks are on point and that there are side triangles, which I have cut out here already. And then we have 2 corner triangles for the corners. So I will be showing you how to lay this out and sew this quilt top together, along with how to do a hanging sleeve. I'm so excited to get started. So let's start stitching. For a quilt top assembly, we have a layout guide right here on the pattern, and this is row 1. So the applique block from Sandrasa at Art Quilts by Design is our bottom point, and then we have Lori's quilt block, which is a 9-patch star, is our second block. We'll sew right sides together 1/4 of an inch, and then we have our first triangle. You want to pay attention to the orientation of the triangle when you sew this on, because if you sew it this way, your triangle is going to be going the wrong direction. So you want to make sure that you have it going the right direction. And again, 1/4 of an inch, right sides together, and we'll have our first row done. You can see how fast this is going to go together. So our first row is all completed. The half square triangles are a little bit larger, so we'll trim those down when we get the whole quilt completed and we go to square everything up to start quilting. So let's start row 2. So now it's time to do row 2. We have our pineapple block, then by Christina, and then we have the bear paw block by Adele, and the Old Maid's puzzle block by Meg, and 1 corner or side triangle. Note the orientation of the triangle. This is really important. And we'll sew sides together 1/4 of an inch, and we'll have row 2 put together. You can see how fast this is going to go. So on our layout guide, we have row 1 and row 2 done. And it didn't matter on the first row with the points because the way Lori set this block up. But on these bear paws, you do want to try to preserve those points and keep them as nice as possible. And then we also had points on Meg's Old Maid puzzle block. So there's that. On the first row, I pressed the seams to the outside. And then on the second row, on the bear paw block, I pressed the seams to the center of this block. And then to the outside on Meg's puzzle block. Here, let me get this back into camera here. So right here. And now we'll move on to our third row. For our third row, we have a side triangle. Note the orientation to the churn dash block by Joe. So these will go right sides together like so. And then we have Jody's carpenter square block and my log cabin block.
It'll go like that. And then we will have one of our corner triangles will be attached here, and this will be for row 3.
For our last row, which is row 4, we have Christina's crystal star block, and we'll be attaching 2 side triangles to either side of this block. We'll start with the right side and then we'll attach the left side. Note the orientation of the triangles. This is very important. Once we have those both sewn right sides together, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, we'll then attach our final corner triangle in the upper right hand corner of this block, and we'll have row 4 done.
So we have our last row finished and our corner attached, and this is row 4. So let's work our way back down the quilt, and now we'll attach row 3. So right sides together, and our blocks are going to attach to these corner triangles. And we'll nest our seams between each of the blocks, right sides together, and preserve your points with your seam allowance. We'll only have to do it on this one for this row. So we have rows 4 and 3 sewn together, and we've got some really nice nesting going on, and our points match really nicely. They match nicely on this block here. And it's time to attach row 2. And row 2 is going to go like this. So we want to nest the seams, preserve the points, and I'll bring this other edge into view with the pineapple block. So again, nesting and preserving these points, and right sides together. And then we'll only have one more row to go after this, and we can start quilting our banner style art quilt. So now we have our second row all attached, and you can see the side triangle here. Now it's time to attach our row 1, which is our final row, and our bottom row, which is this here, to our art quilt. So right sides together, matching and nesting the seams like before, preserving these points, and one last seam, and we'll be all done. Now that we have our top all constructed, I'm going to go along and trim off these dog ears and get my outside seam allowance at 1/4 of an inch. So I'm lining up my ruler so that 1/4 of an inch is right on my points so that I can trim off some of the extra that we have. You can see here on this one, there's a little, like an 1/8 of an inch extra there. And then we'll square up this corner because we're working on the bias. This just makes it more precise when we go to load it onto the long arm and put our seam binding on. I like to do 1/2 inch seam bindings. So I will always leave 1/4 of an inch of my batting and my backing extending. And this way we have all of our dog ears cut off. come back and do this corner here. We have a little dog ear down here. And we know that we have 1/4 of an inch left on those blocks. We just cut off that dog ear so we don't have to deal with it later on. We'll do the same thing on this side. And now we'll go load this onto the long arm. I have my backing fabric all cut out and my binding, and let's see what I can design for these blocks.
Because our Sprout Quilt Challenge 2025 was a sampling of different styles of blocks designed by different designers, I decided that I would quilt each block with a different filler block. And I'm still experimenting with my Gamel retrofit, so I hadn't done any of this yet. And that's where you work within a boundary and then you set a design. And I did learn a lot, and I was really grateful to have this as an opportunity to try different motifs and play around with the boundaries. And you can really see the designs on the back of this. I used a contrasting thread so that you could really see what was going on. And it just turned out so smart. I'm so excited about this and learning how to play with this upgrade on my long arm. So now we're going to trim down our backing fabric. And I have, let's see how much this is here. I have about 6.5 inches left over on the one end of my quilt from quilting. And so I want to preserve this because I'm going to use it for creating my sleeve. Let me find my ruler. Oh, here it is. So I like to keep 1/4 of an inch because I like I said before, to have 1/2 inch seam binding. So I try to line up my 1/4 of an inch mark on the edge of my quilt top for trimming. And like right here, there's a little wiggle where it kind of sucks in a little bit. So we'll have to fudge it a little bit there, but we'll be fine. And I don't want to cut, get this, I don't want to cut down in here because I'm going to use this for the quilt sleeve. And I'll be showing you how to make that. Quilt sleeves are kind of like labels and binding. You don't always want to take the time to do it, but if you do it at the and force yourself to do it, you'll get it done. There's so much to learn with this new long arm application that I got. And I'm hoping that my workload will lighten up a little bit where I can just sit down and play with it. And I have a backlog of quilt tops, as I'm sure you all have, um, that need to be quilted. So some are sample quilts that never got dealt with, but it'll be a great opportunity for me to get a lot of learning in under my belt. It's when you get a new machine, it's just kind of like you have to get your reps in, so to speak, because there's so much to learn. I don't know if you've noticed there's a basting thread here, and they recommend that you do that. I had never done a basting on a quilt top before. I usually just kind of lightly pin it, but it is really helpful, I have to say. I have learned a lot because by no means am I a quilter. Or, there are people who specialize in decorative quilting, and I had some motifs that I was able to do hand guided on my machine before I upgraded it. Um, and I am looking forward to diving into some ruler work, but in order to do that, I have to drop the belts on my machine in order to do it, and I'm not quite sure how that works, and that's more learning, and I really haven't been able to set my mind at that yet. So I am looking forward to some extra time to do that. Now that I have all of the backing and batting trimmed off the art quilt, you can see some of the motifs that I've done in these sample blocks. And this one on Sandrasa's turned out really nice. I got it pretty close. There's one corner that's a little bit wonky, and definitely as I learn more, I'll get these better centered in the future. But it was a lot of fun to see how all of these digital patterns turned out on this quilt. I've gone ahead and cut my backing fabric and my binding fabrics. So now we will make our binding strips. And if you use the center crease of your binding strip, that with it facing up towards you, that will determine your right side. It's hard to determine that when you're working on a solid fabric, and that's always my indication. So we'll have that facing up, and then we'll place our next strip at a 45-degree angle. And if you keep the second strip up on your work surface, it won't shift when you cut your 45-degree angle and place a pin. You'll notice that I've offset the two pieces about a quarter of an inch or more, and that's just so that we don't have any jogs once we go to press the seam binding seams open. And we'll continue to do this with all of the strips. And you can see how easily this is to do once you get in a rhythm, pinning each one as we go. And now that we're done doing all of that, we can take it over to the sewing machine and sew our strips together. And we'll press right sides together when we're finished, trim off our dog ears, and we can now attach it to our quilt once we have it quilted. So now we have our seam binding all on. I've attached it to the back, and I'll stitch it down on the front. I was really happy that my basting stitches ended up inside my seam line here. So we'll just hand stitch this down. Got some navy thread here on a bobbin that I'll uh, clean off, and my little stitch kit, which I always keep handy. I like to use these larger needles to do my stitching, and a leather thimble. And I have clips here to help hold it down as I stitch. And you can see that I have mitered these corners. This is one of the top corners, so it's a 45-degree. But down here, where we don't have a 45-degree, I don't even know what that degree is, but it's going to stitch down really nicely. I'll finesse it a little bit so that it's real precise when I go to do that. And once I get all this stitched down, then we'll start working on the sleeve construction. So let's start stitching. So you can see how I've done that, and the corner matches up beautifully. We'll bury our tails underneath. And I want to stitch this down. I'm going to use a ladder stitch, so I'm going to take a tiny little bit off of the top, and then underneath I'm going to take a tiny little stitch, kind of how we did the hand turned applique block. So that was from the bottom. Now we'll go from the top. Now that we're at the end, we can come underneath. Don't need that clip anymore. Well, I like to do ladder stitch on my binding. Because I use these larger needles, I can do 2 stitches at a time. And I didn't have to take out my basting stitches from the quilting, so that was nice. So I'm going to continue in this manner all the way around the quilt. So now we have our quilt all finished, quilted, the seam binding all attached on the front. And now it's time to do the hanging sleeve. So what I like to do is I like to leave a little bit of um, a setback on the hanging sleeve from the edge of the quilt. Measure from side to side, and cut your hanging sleeve 6 inches wide by the length of your quilt. Obviously, if your quilt is over 44 inches, you'll need to do a second strip and join them in the center. And you can see here, I've already pressed a double fold over hem, which I will top stitch down on both ends. And we're going to enclose this tube essentially with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance with wrong sides together. But before I do that, I am going to apply my commercial label here that says TJ Wright Quilts on it, and I'll stitch this down by machine before I enclose this tube. So I have the quilt sleeve all constructed. I have sewn this right sides together, and I pressed the tube with the seam going down the center. And this is so when we flip it over to stitch it on, we just don't even see that seam. But I want to show you what I've done. You notice that there are 2 creases here, here and here. So this top crease is just from us pressing the tube flat. But when we go to stitch it down, we don't want to just stitch along the top and the bottom, because that will cause this top edge to bow out when we put it on a rod. So I like to leave about a 1/2 an inch, because that's the dimension of our seam binding, so that when you put the rod in, it doesn't cause it to bow, but will give it some give. And so if I stitch down the very top, and I'll pin it in place, we'll stitch along the top, and then we'll stitch around the back side of the tube on each end. Then we'll end where that crease is. So on this tube where we're going to stitch along this edge right here, which is going to be next to the quilt. And then we'll use this second crease that I've done to as our guide for stitching the bottom. And you can see that if I stitch here, hand stitch here, and this rolls up, it doesn't roll past the finished edge of the top of the quilt. And so this is how I like doing it. I think this is a really great tip. Always keep this in mind. And that way, it's not on the back in a sloppy manner. It's just nice and tidy. You can make sure that you center um, the sleeve on your quilt with the recesses on the ends, and then you can just insert a rod. I like to use a piece of flat lathe if I'm going to be hanging it on the wall. More than likely, this will just go on a rod. So now it's time to stitch that down. Now we have our hanging sleeve all stitched down. I stitched around along the top. I stitched down to where I had one of my creases here, along here. And then when we flip this back, you can see how that second crease is just a really great guide to be able to do the stitching on the back side so that we have some ease for the rod or however you're going to hang it. I mentioned some lath, and this is lath. It's a little over a quarter of an inch thick, and I've just cut it to size and drilled a couple holes on each end. And I like the lath because then the quilt hangs really, really flat if you're going to hang it on the wall. And you just put a nail in each end, and you're nice and even, and you can see that it's not going to rotate up over the top edge of the quilt. So this is my preferred method, but you could definitely use a decorative rod, which is really attractive as well. So now I'm going to go hang this up so you can see how it all looks. It turned out just gorgeous. I'm so excited to share with you that I have finished my banner style art quilt for the Sprout Quilt Challenge 2025. And I want to thank all of the pattern designers from the Quilt Designers Collective for giving their time, designing these blocks, and just pouring their heart and soul into this. It's quite an endeavor to put on one of these 7-week challenges. And so I want to thank them for all of their hard work. It was so much fun. This banner that I designed, you'll notice is on point. So this is a great way if you haven't done on point before to kind of step into that. Um, the blocks that the designers came up with really capture the whole concept of the Sprout Quilt Challenge 2025, which is about finding our roots. And we were able to take traditional blocks, make them modern, or if you're more of a traditional quilter, you could make them more traditional. I We also did mostly solids, so that gave it a little bit more of a modern twist. Although some of the people that have participated in the challenge have gone ahead and used prints, and they're just gorgeous. They've done a really great job. This project was good for me because I recently had a long arm retrofitted to be digital and to be computerized. And so it gave me opportunity to play around with some of the blocks that they have loaded into the system. And so each one of these blocks has a different quilting motif in it, although I did keep it consistent in the corners around the edges. So I couldn't be more thrilled. I'm so excited to have this done, and it was really great to be able to play around with just solids. The solids that I used were from cherry wood hand dye, and they do a wonderful job with their hand dyes. They have a kind of a soft, almost antique feel to them. Very, very durable, nice saturation of color. So until we meet again, happy stitching.